All right. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa lil uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Rabbi zidni ilma. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we send peace and blessings upon our final messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Welcome back everyone to the and we had some dropouts. Okay, cool. Where is share screen? There we go. Okay. Welcome back everyone to the Silru story night, a series. Alhamdulillah, this is the last of the series that we're going to be doing for this semester. We are on part 14 of the story of Musa alayhi salam, and it ends up wrapping up quite well because today will probably be the last week of Musa alayhi salam in Egypt, though we might need a quick addendum to it the next time we start. But we've been going through the story of Musa alayhi salam as it's found in the Quran, each week focusing on either one conversation or one telling of the story of Musa alayhi salam, in order to try to unpack how this story is not just a story that occurred once, but one of the eternal conversations or the eternal archetypal stories that human beings would constantly be going through. And that's, of course, how all of the stories in the Quran are put together, but with particular emphasis on the story of Musa alayhi salam, because he is the most mentioned prophet in the Quran, and his story is found the most numerous times within this text. So we've been making special emphasis on specific characters that represent kind of interesting dynamics that human beings find themselves in. Last week, we did a parallel between the magicians who submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a complete result of kind of the showdown that took place, and also random Egyptians who also submitted to Musa alayhi salam. From even the family of Fir'aun, who of course not submitted to Musa but submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through witnessing the miracles of Musa alayhi salam. So we focused on that. And today what we're going to focus on mainly is going to be the response from Fir'aun and how the trials start afflicting both the Bani Israel and the oppressors or the Egyptians, and how there's separate responses. And what we can really gather is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of teaching people or trying people is really some of the major emphases that I want to focus on today. And with that, I want to come back to the idea that right after this huge showdown took place, and some people from the family of Fir'aun said, we believe in Musa, the magicians have done that, the people of Egypt are now really thinking about it. And they're wondering, do I continue to try to keep status quo? Or do I submit? Or do I change my ways in some way? And some of them decided to, of course, oppose Fir'aun, but many of them decided to do nothing about it. And Fir'aun, as his response, he also had a response. And he said he's going to make the lives of the Bani Israel so much more difficult now. And anyone who follows the Bani Israel, if you try to change anything about our way of life, we're going to make things difficult for you. And last week we focused on the ayah, which is on the screen right now in Surah Al-A'raf, ayah number 29, in which قَالُوا أُوذِينَا مِن قَبْلِ. We used to have it hard before we've been harmed. Adhan took place before on us. تأتينا ومن بعد ما جئتنا. And now that you're here, we still are in a moment of harm. Like, we're still in pain. So the Bani Israel is basically saying to Musa somewhat that, like, we were suffering before and now we're suffering now. What have you actually changed? If anything, our suffering now is worse because they're still under the regime of Pharaoh. And they're like, not only that, but now Pharaoh's mad at us. Before he was just like, it was annoying, but we didn't have his wrath to deal with. Now he thinks you're going to start this whole revolution or something. And our life has become so much harder. And Musa, remember, this is what I wanted to end off with last week, and it's going to be even more apparent in the next couple of ayat that come in. قَالَ عَسَى رَبُّكُمْ أَن يُهْلِكَ عَدُوَّكُمْ وَيَسْتَخْلِفَكُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَيَنْظُرَ كَيْفَ تَعْمَلُونَ. Maybe it could be that your Lord would destroy your enemy and would make you the ones who have them istakhlifukum. You'd be on top of them on the earth. And then we'll see فَيَنْظُرْ كَيْفَ تَعْمَلُونَ. And then we'll see how well you would do in that situation. Meaning, Musa basically had to tell them that, like, I understand. He's not saying this isn't a trial. He's like, I understand this is a trial, but what they're going through, the test of power is also a trial. meaning your oppressors, Allah is about to reveal their true colors just as your true colors are about to be revealed. That is at the end of the day what the purpose of a test actually is. Has nothing to do with the outcome. It is to show what you have earned as a result of it. And I think it's an important point to realize, especially when it's talking about witnessing a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What's a miracle going to do at the end of the day? It's going to bring out what you were already working on this whole time. And just like Pharaoh is being tested and his true colors are being shown. And what are those true colors? Ugliness. The Bani Israel has that moment as well. How are we going to respond in this moment? That'll be what's actually valuable. So I wanted to end like that was the conversation where we ended last week, and now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will then talk about how he tried the people of Egypt right after this. So after it was almost like the sign was shown to them, then we're going to get into this. What are the now end results of that sign? It's almost as if the seeds of action have been put forward. Let the Bani Israel go and stop taking Fir'aun as your Lord. Those seem to be the two kind of takeaways. Now we'll see how it's responded. But any questions or comments before we dive into today's ayat? Not going to jump straight in, inshallah. وَلَقَدْ أَخَذْنَا آلَ فِرْعَوْنَ بِالسِّنِينَ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الثَّمَرَاتِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَذَّكَّرُونَ. The first things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah did after this is, and we seized the people of Fir'aun بِالسِّنِينَ وَنَقْصٍ with a deficit for a number of years مِنَ الثَّمَرَاتِ from fruit. So Egypt used to be a world power, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took away some of their economic prowess. Thamarat is typically translated as two things. It is generally translated as fruits, but it's not just any type of fruits. It's the fruits that come from a faraway place. Meaning that a thamar would be a fruit that is out of season, meaning it had to travel from somewhere to get there. So what's really being talked about is it lost its economic station. Because where do you get fruits from far away? You get them from other countries. You get them from like trade routes, and you get them from like good relations. What probably took place first was Egypt was a superpower. Maybe their economy tanked. Maybe their global relations went down the drain. That seemed to be the first of it, that their provisions were decreased. I'm going to get into lessons very, very soon, but this one is a pretty direct one. That there are certain times in which our wealth deludes us and wealth deludes people. And one of the ways that Allah wants to wake us up at oftentimes will be to restrict it just a little bit, to see how are we going to respond to that degree of restriction. So that's the first thing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah did for to the whole people of Egypt. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then continues and said, فَإِذَا جَاءَتْهُمُ الْحَسَنَةُ قَالُوا لَنَا هَذِهِ. And when we gave them, when Allah gave them good, فَإِذَا جَاءَتْ, and good was given to them, قَالُوا لَنَا هَذِهِ. This is for us. We've earned it by ourselves. وَإِن تُصِبْهُمْ سَيِّئَةٌ يَطَيَّرُوا بِمُوسَى وَمِن مَّعَهُ. And when there was any bit of trial that afflicted them, they said, these are the evil things that you, Moses, and your people have brought us. أَلَا إِنَّمَا طَائِرُهُمْ عِندَ اللَّهِ وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. The only evil omens that they had with them are like it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that caused them, but most of them don't know. Now that really coming down to, there's a huge conversation about Egypt was a very superstitious place, to the point where like random gods were responsible for everything. If you did this in the wrong order, if you did this in the wrong order, it was the cause of evil omens. So that's one thing of like none of those are there. It's Allah who's causing everything to happen to begin with. But the other is, I would say the first half of that ayah really speaks to what did the trial actually do? The trial exposed on their inside what was really kind of brewing all along, which was any good is from us, any bad is from everyone else. What is the society not doing? This is what led it to be so corrupt. They only have good for themselves, and they have nothing but bad to say about anyone other than themselves. the point of the trial is it purified. Literally, like that's what a fitna does. A fitna, it comes from the idea of like fatan. A blacksmith puts a bunch of rocks and precious metals and all this into a hot fire. And what happens at the end of that really heated exchange, whatever is actually in there comes to the surface. So you're able to separate between the essence of something. If there was actually gold there, it shows up as gold. If there was no gold, if there was no precious metal, it's just going to be a bunch of rocks that shine to the surface as well. And you realize you had nothing of value. And that's what's being done. What's being shown about them? What do they have the ability of doing? They're entitled. They've been entitled this entire time. When there was any good, we did it. Is any bad? Other people did it. Not willing to take responsibility at all. And that also is something that happens at a time of economic scarcity. That yes, you do have economic scarcity that leads to some bad, but economic scarcity also leads to some good. And what I mean by that is, think about a moment in which, think about a good family. And they had a plan to go outside and spend an awesome day outside. And then the weather is terrible. So they all stay inside. A good family would find a way to do what? Maybe let's play some board games. Maybe let's just bake some pizza. Let's all cook together and still do what? Have quality time together. Because what was their intention? Have quality time together. But unfortunately, what can also take place in a time of scarcity? That like if they were just trying to run away from their home, like spending time with each other, and the only point of going outside was an escape, what do people do? They're at each other's throats in the home. Because what did that trial or that affliction get them? It actually gave them a more purified way of experiencing what they already had inside. I'm hoping this makes sense. I can't see any of you, so someone like give me a thumbs up or some sort of emote, so I know I'm not talking to just a bunch of faceless things. Thank you, Ala. But so that's what's happening to the people of Egypt in that moment. That what's coming out? Their sense of entitlement, their sense of how they used to run things, and if anything, it's making them more and more miserable. That Allah is pointing out the cracks at the seams that they just haven't been addressing. And why have they not been addressing it? Because they were entitled. They had a bunch of things to be distracted by. Economic power. There's wealth rolling into Egypt. So we don't have to worry about any of these. Allah is actually exposing all of the weaknesses and the structures that are around them. I've been talking for a long time. Questions or comments before we keep going?
I have one small question.
Sure.
So the part where it says their evil omens are with Allah, are they attributing evil to Allah, or what is exactly like? I know you're not supposed to do that, right?
Yeah, when they ascribe evil omens to Musa and those that are with him, they're trying to say Moses is the cause of all of it, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like, it's not him. What is it at the end of the day? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the cause of all the good and all the bad.
Aren't you like attributing it to Allah then? Because I know you're supposed to say good is like with Allah, and then like the bad stuff that happened in your life, you're supposed to keep it away from Allah, right?
Yeah. So this is where there's a difference between an academic approach to it and a personal approach to it. What I mean by that is like, do we believe that even the trials in our lives are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Yes, we do, but the moral judgment is we only attribute good to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning that, did Allah cause a situation that I experienced pain and loss? Maybe. Do we ever say that it was evil? No. When we say evil, we say like قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِالْفَلَقِ مِنْ شَرِّ مَا خَلَقَ, from the evil of that which was created. Meaning Allah didn't necessarily create evil, but we might experience sometimes the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as evil. So it's out of etiquette. It's more about how you speak. Did Allah create a situation in which maybe you experienced some harm? Yeah, but these people are doing literally the opposite. That they don't attribute any good to Allah, they attribute good only to themselves, and they attribute only evil to Musa and his and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If they wanted to be fair academically, they would do both, but they didn't. They actually flipped the script of what's even decent to do.
That makes sense. And I have another small question was, so when the famine was happening, it says years, it mentioned that it took years for the famine to happen. Meantime, did Pharaoh continue to like, abuse the people of Israel and just like kill all the babies and everything?
So we're going to see that happening very soon. The killing of babies would take place systematically, meaning that every few years this would happen. From my understanding, that didn't continue. It does happen a little bit later on, where Pharaoh gets fed up, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also puts a final decree on them, and we'll get to that in a few ayat. But the general oppression continued to increase in these years. So the other thing I want us to keep in mind is a lot of us have been fed this narrative, like Musa alayhi salam came to the people of Egypt, and like within a week they were gone. Months and years passed. The Musa alayhi salam is with the Bani Israel, suffering with the Bani Israel.
Makes sense. Jazakallah khair.
Anyone else? Any reflections, comments, or questions? Always appreciate them. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then continues, and most of them don't actually know that what the appropriate way of actually speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, and like what the actual true causes of things are. If anything, we could make the argument that if it hadn't been for the people's arrogance and the people's injustice, would they be restricted? No. So who are actually the cause of the evil? We could say it's actually them. It's their own omen, right? They're attributing it to Musa alayhi salam. You caused this to happen, but this is where we have to be really careful, especially when we get trials, and sometimes we seek an explanation. It's because of so and so. No, Allah's not unjust like that. You're not gonna suffer through someone else's action. Allah's actually bringing the trial is for you. In that same way, what I mean by that is, here's where I have to call out. There's not. I guess I'll just call this out because ta'ira is being put forward like omens. How many of you have ever? Well, I can't see your faces. Like this is a rhetorical question more than anything. But like someone gets sick and a family member blames nazar. Like someone did nazar on you. Someone like looked at you wrong or like gave you the evil eye. And suddenly, what are we doing? We're suddenly attributing someone else for our own affliction. When what we're supposed to, in my opinion, do in that moment is seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Maybe there's good in it for us. Maybe there's a lesson to be learned in this sickness. Maybe in this I'm going to recognize something. So we are actually supposed to pray for the best, not try to look for a scapegoat for the actual responsible party for this. I know psychologically that makes us feel like it's almost a self-preservation technique. If it wasn't for this and this, my child wouldn't suffer. My house would be okay. My insert whatever you want here. I'm not trying to negate the reality of things like the evil eye, but what I am saying is the attitude with which we respond changes and should be along the lines of expect that no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted something good in it. Because if Allah puts you through a trial, it's because you had the ability of benefiting from that trial, or what's actually inside for it to come out. And you want whatever is inside in that moment to be something that's pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So hoping that makes sense. And then they continue, وَقَالُوا مَهْمَا تَأْتِنَا بِهِ مِنْ آيَةٍ لِيَسْحَرَنَا بِهَا فَمَا نَحْنُ لَكَ بِمُؤْمِنِينَ. And they said, whatever you bring us of all of this from the sign so that you have bewitched us with it, we're never going to be believing. So they made up their minds that whatever you bring, you would think that as you're experiencing more and more and more signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what would happen? You'd be more and more convinced. But what's actually happening to them? Their hearts are being closed more and more and more with every single kind of sign. Because at the end of the day, is it the heart that makes a decision or the mind that makes a decision? We like to tell ourselves it's always the mind. It's usually the heart that's making the decision. And what's happening to their hearts? Getting more and more kind of convinced that this is not, that they're not going to be believers, because belief actually enters into the heart. And then Allah continues and puts down a series of 7 trials that they go through. فَأَرْسَلْنَا عَلَيْهِمُ الطُّوفَانَ. So we afflicted them, or we sent them first the flood, وَالْجَرَادَ, and then locusts, وَالْقُمَّلَ, and lice or bed bugs, وَالضَّفَادِعَ, and frogs, وَالدَّمَّ, and blood, وَآيَاتٍ مُفَصَّلَاتٍ, and major signs other than that as well. Generally speaking, that's understood to be the last of the major sign, which was this death that took place of all of the newborns of Egypt. That's what we get kind of from biblical sources. فَاسْتَكْبَرُوا, but in each of them, they showed more and more arrogance. وَكَانُوا قَوْمًا مُجْرِمِينَ, and they were a people that proved their criminality through all of it. Meaning, and again, these didn't all just happen like 2 seconds. In like 2 seconds, in like the same week, they got hit with all of them. It seemed to be disaster after disaster after disaster after disaster after disaster, kept being hit. They kept being hit by it. And the hope of each disaster was, hey, maybe they'll wake up. Maybe they'll realize it. Maybe they'll wake up. Maybe they'll realize it. But Allah says they didn't do any of that. Fastakbaru. What all they did is they buckled down on their arrogance. And we could make the argument that as these are happening, when you think about if a famine hits a place, the famine was the first one, right? So there's the first major sign, then the 6 signs that come after it. Who gets affected more, rich people or poor people? Poor people. They suffer more. But who feels like they suffer more? Rich people. But I want you to think about that. When the economy goes down, who actually suffers more? Poor people. Who feels like they suffer more? Rich people, because they have lost more because they had more to lose. But are they the ones who are actually physically suffering? No, everyone is suffering. But what oftentimes happens is you start, like, the bonds of families become stronger. In who? In people who have scarcity. You know who the bonds of family become super weak? The people who have a lot. Because they still don't have enough. Kind of interesting how that works. I would imagine that's part of what was going on in each of these trials. Because an argument could be made that what the Bani Israel are suffering too, but their suffering is not like the suffering of the Egyptians. The suffering of the Egyptians is breaking the fabric of their society down. The suffering of the Bani Israel, one is they're more well equipped to suffer because they've been suffering already. And in their suffering, they're probably getting closer together. They're actually getting strengthened through it versus the others are getting weakened. Hoping that makes sense as well. Thank you, Allah. And
This verse,
go
sorry.
ahead.
I just want to say that this verse reminds me of, I think I heard a hadith somewhere that once around the day of judgment, once like the one major sign comes, the rest will fall like a bead on like a string or whatever. This reminds me of that one after another hardship hit, and then hardships would hit. And it seemed like it kind of, I just found it kind of like parallel to the day of judgment, like the hadith.
Yeah, definitely. There's the hadith that Shurban is referring to is there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that says that the signs of the last hour will be like a bead that's cut. So meaning, like, if you imagine like a string of beads and you cut one end of it, when you start pulling at the string in the beginning, what happens? Like 1 bead falls, 2 bead falls, 3 beads fall. But the more you start pulling and the more vertical it becomes, all of them start coming down chain by chain. That's exactly what seems to have happened here. Is 1, 2, 3. It seems like they're being added up little by little or not little by little, but like they're being compartmentalized, or a complementary effect that one seems to lead to the other, to the other, to the other. And the other part of this I have to always appreciate is there were probably like people trying. Yes, we see these, and Allah tells us these are signs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but there were probably people who were trying to justify this. I mean by that, they're like, oh, the lack of fruits, the vegetation was down, so that led to more flooding. So when there was more flooding, the locusts came because their homes weren't whatever. And then the frogs were trying to eat the light. They were probably trying to like connect them together to make them seem like quote unquote natural phenomena. But even if you do have a natural explanation, that does not mean it's not a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I always just think about that as well. There were probably people in Egypt who are the rationalists, who are like, these aren't acts of God. What are they? They're just random occurrences in nature. even if they are, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do something about it. So I just imagine that these conversations were probably going on. And you had people like, no, we need to reform. Others like, no, it's just a phase. It'll just pass. It's like, oh, humans are ruining the environment. It's just a phase of the earth. We should just do nothing about it. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Like overconsumption isn't causing any problems. People are like, we don't do anything. Others like, we should take responsibility, even if it is. We're going to be better off if we take some responsibility right now. So we think that these discussions only happened at a certain point, but how many trials do we have to be hit with? Aren't storms getting worse? Isn't the economy globally kind of suffering? Aren't there sicknesses that we haven't seen before? So, I mean, I just find this to be very relevant in every time and place, but especially weirdly enough in the news cycle that we find ourselves in. But they showed arrogance. فَاسْتَكْبَرُوا وَكَانُوا قَوْمًا مُجْرِمِينَ. And they were criminal people. The other thing that started happening is once they show arrogance, their arrogance led them into further criminal behavior. Because this is another kind of rule of when scarcity hits, crime increases. It's just a thing. Crime continuously started to increase because when people are tried is when their true colors start showing. And their true colors were corruption. I could even imagine jurm is harm, but jurm is also things are improperly ordered, meaning that, well, not that I want to make these examples hit too much home. Well, let's let them hit home. When there's fear in an economy, does it lead to more people getting justice? No. What does it oftentimes lead to? The rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. That when we use the example of COVID, right? The vaccine should be here for our most vulnerable population as soon as they were developed. Who is getting them first? The rich and famous. They get them first. Oftentimes those that needed it maybe the least, who had the ability of quarantining, who had the ability of doing these. No, but they don't want to give up their lifestyle. They showed arrogance. وَكَانُوا قَوْمًا مُجْرِمُونَ. And in their arrogance, that caused them to do even more jurm, to do even more criminal behavior as a result of it. Because you have two options when you're faced with trial. You have the option of submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and going back to justice that might require you to lose some of your comfort, or to say, no, my comfort is more important and my morals fall by the wayside. So interesting how that works. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues. What is their next response on top of that? وَلَمَّا وَقَعَ عَلَيْهِمِ الرِّجْزُ. And when like all of these rijzu punishments fell on them, قالوا يا موسى ادع لنا ربك بما أحد عندك لئن كشفت عنا الرجز لنؤمنن لك ولنرسلن معك بني إسرائيل. So when the punishments keep hitting them over and over again, they said, just call your Lord, and whatever he has promised to you, tell him to like remove it. Just remove it for us. Kashafta anna. Like remove it from us for a little bit, and we'll believe in everything you were saying, and we'll send the Bani Israel with you. We'll stop oppressing the Bani Israel. And so, it looks like it's kind of working, but lip service is not enough. فلما كشفنا عنهم الرجس إلى أجل هم بالغوه إذا هم ينكثون. But when we removed the punishment for just a little bit amount of time, and as soon as we did that, they broke their word. They're like, oh yeah, no, we could imagine that they said, we're going to fix things. This also comes down to sometimes social change. When you're advocating for social change and someone goes, we'll just fix this one thing for just a little bit, and then they put like a band-aid on it, and someone requires surgery. And as soon as they do it, they go back to their old ways of corruption. They go back to their old ways in whatever the case may be. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says, and they broke their end of the bargain. So what ends up happening is Allah continues in the next ayah, but they denied and we took retribution from them. فانتقمنا منهم فأغرقناهم في اليم بأنهم كذبوا بآياتنا وكانوا عنها غافلين. So because of that, because they denied it, we took retribution. We took retribution because they denied it. We drowned them in the sea because they denied our signs over and over again, and they were ghafil at this point. They didn't even realize that this is just what they do over and over again. Allah gave them every chance to come to a realization, but each time it was generally the same, and so much to the point where it almost turns into a negotiation. You do this, I do this. You did this, I do this. It's no longer trying to prepare themselves to be better people, even. It was an exchange. And that's not acceptable. And to the point where we're going to focus on more ayat of when Fir'aun himself drowns, that'll be found in different ayat in the Quran. But the end result was just this, that it led to complete destruction. But the destruction came in stages. First, there was almost an exposure. Who are you? First was just giving them news, how they can rectify themselves. They don't choose to rectify it. Okay, let me give you another one. Okay, maybe you weren't hit by the miracle, so let's take away the distractions that you had. Your economic security was your distraction. Take that away. Your health, your wealth, your all of these different layers were removed from them. Your comfort, all of them are removed. Even then, they doubled down on their ways. They became more arrogant at that point, and then they started trying to play games with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They did that. Okay, it's the final straw. The punishments, quote unquote, the trials, are not a sense of increasing their suffering or anything like that. It was actually, maybe some of them will submit, and I can imagine maybe some did. We did have in the family of Fir'aun himself, we had people last week who submitted. Maybe people submitted at every single one of these stages. But for others, they proved themselves that they were deserving of the ultimate punishment over and over and over again. Questions or comments? You guys have been extremely silent today. Or reflections? Okay. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues, and this is kind of how we started off this whole story of Musa alayhi salam, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned that we would cause the Bani Israel to inherit the dominion. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَوْرَثْنَا الْقَوْمَ الَّذِينَ كَانُوا يُسْتَضْعَفُونَ مَشَارِقَ الْأَرْضِ وَمَغَارِبَهَا الَّتِي بَارَكْنَا فِيهَا. And this is how we made we made inheritors the people of those who were considered weak, for both the eastern parts of the land and for the western parts of the land, and we blessed them both in it. فَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ الْحُسْنَى, and we fulfilled it, and it was fulfilled by the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the best words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon ala bani Israel bima sabaru, because they were patient. وَدَمَّرْنَا مَا كَانَ يَصْنَعُ فِرْعَوْنُ وَقَوْمُهُ وَمَا كَانُوا يُعْرِشُونَ. And we destroyed what used to be the Pharaoh and his people and what they used to try to build as their huge legacies behind them. That what legacy do they have now? All of that has been destroyed, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instead preserved a people who were patient instead. So this will be kind of like that high resolution. That's what Surah Al-Araf generally does, is the high resolution view of what took place. And what took place was trial after trial after trial was given to them. The people finally, this was their end result, that Allah replaced them. Because at the end of the day, it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who had given them power, and when Allah removed it, they tried to hold on without acknowledging that Allah was the one who gave them the power to begin with. And then eventually, what did that lead to? their destruction and it being inherited by people who did have patience, the people who did acknowledge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were at the end of the day where it ended up. And I think the story of the people of Fir'aun, or the people of Egypt, is just an interesting thing to think about, because even historically, when we think about nation states, the superpower that most of the time is looked at is Egypt, as this idea of this like lasting nation. And it's really weird that that gets done. Whether that was Rome, whether that's the United States, whether that's we think of like pyramids as like this structure of power. We think about like that's what like Pharaoh is really known for to this day. The columns of Egypt. It I don't know what to make of it other than like it should make us think that like are those what we want to inherit? Or did Allah SWT do quite the opposite of saying that we caused that powerful nation to be inherited by slaves, essentially? And who did Allah prefer? Did Allah prefer the crazy towers and like the crazy world superpower, or this group of people that was just suffering over and over again, but that suffering didn't take away their faith? That Allah blessed those people with a messenger, and the others, what were they given? Trial after trial after trial. But I do have to say, in fairness though, after they failed all of the trials is when they earned the status, not because of their riches necessarily. They're just saying, just because the nation is rich, just because all of this is happening, does not mean that they are doomed. When they have that, and then they are tried over and over again, that seems to be the legacy of Egypt, and then they fail all of those. That's when there's this huge judgment that seems to be put forward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I saw a couple of the comments that you guys are writing. Yeah, it's kind of like makes you think about things like the pyramid on the dollar bill. I'm not going down conspiracy theory land. No, we're not going to talk about the jaw on the eye on the dollar bill or anything like that. But yeah, it does make you think in terms of like the archetypes that of success that Allah puts forward, and the archetypes of success that oftentimes are found within our own like day-to-day items and mentalities that we use.
One thing I kind of also found parallel, I feel like at one point we were talking about this is off like Zoom, but we were talking about how, like for example, throughout like Indian history, you see different kings in the Mughal Empire who came along, and the first few kings were like the greatest kings, and then as you go down the line, the kings turn more arrogant and ignorant, and like, you know, kind of like turn into a bad king. And then I feel like pharaohs, compared to the pharaoh that existed during I think it was the Yusuf Yusuf time, to the one right now, as you kind of go down, like I guess like the years, it kind of he just turns into a worse and worse person, or like the person in power just gets worse.
Yeah,
I don't know.
no, that's definitely true. um that's something to think about is yeah, the trial of power is something that's described over and over again. We see the same lesson historically presenting itself, where whether they're Muslim rulers or non-Muslim rulers, this idea when power stays in one space for way too long, it seems to like, I don't know what it is. Like there's that common thing of like absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's true, but it brings out the worst oftentimes in terms of like what qualities that a person has, or it does the opposite. We'll also have to sometimes appreciate that there are sometimes really good examples of someone who voluntarily gave up power or used power appropriately, that it brought out the best of what a human being was capable of. So we do have both examples, but it does seem to have this archetypal type of relationship. Yeah. Um, I we have about 15 or 20 minutes. I was planning on saving these next set of ayat because I wanted to make sure to give this its proper due of the attention of like the high resolution view of what happened to the people of Pharaoh. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does seem to treat two things separately. One is the people of Pharaoh are described here, and then Allah specifically in other places like Surah Yunus will talk about specifically what Pharaoh does. He has his own kind of way around this when he goes chasing them. And I guess I'll introduce that concept right now. Is when they were heedless of them, they were heedless of our signs. Fir'aun apparently, as each of these things are happening to them, right? Where are we? The list in ayah 133. And then the last sign is ayatin mufassalatin, like a manifest sign, like a miraculous sign. Everything else seems to be natural signs. And one of them is different. Pharaoh goes like this. He has all of these signs are afflicting Fir'aun. He says, you know what? You know what started all of this is because I didn't kill all of the newborn ones when it started. So he goes and puts the kill order of all of the newborns of the Bani Israel are killed once again, like all the firstborns, anyone who's still alive. And once he does that, the same thing is done, apparently, with the Egyptians. Allah SWT puts it forward, so the angel of death goes and kills all of the firstborns in Egypt are actually killed as well. And when that happens, Pharaoh just goes, "You guys just leave. I'm done with dealing with you." And then when he retreats to his private quarters, he's like, "Now that they're all in one place and they're all going, now we're going to just do the final solution and kill them all." So it is this idea of like he showed his arrogance in trying to control things that was taken away from him, and then he turned back on his word. So it's again very similar to what he did, what the people did in totality, saying, "Hey, just remove it for us a little bit, just and then we'll be going back." Pharaoh does the exact same thing, but then he increases in arrogance with every single moment. So he goes chasing the Bani Israel as they're crossing over to, the Red Sea. And most of you have heard the story that the people of Egypt, Bani Israel, they take all of their belongings with them, whatever they can carry, which is just very little, because they have to trek this huge trek of land. They get to the Red Sea, and as they're crossing it, behind them is the army of Pharaoh. And as Musa and his people make it across, Pharaoh is on the other side. He's running there trying to exterminate them, getting more and more desperate in terms of trying to maintain himself. And he does, most of us know the story as well. He drowns. And also that actually captures, maybe I'll get to this one ayah. I believe it's Surah Yunus, ayah number 90. And Maryam, I did not, if someone could read Maryam's comment, that would be awesome.
It took me a while to type this, so my apologies if we've already moved on from the concept of power. But I think power and money don't necessarily change who you are as much as amplify the traits you already possess. That's deep.
Maryam, I would definitely agree with you. That power doesn't necessarily change who you are, but I think you captured that exactly right. It makes much more apparent what you have. Would be, I think, a more appropriate way of saying. But oftentimes, the one part I would say there's a slight, and I wouldn't even say I'm disagreeing with you, but oftentimes the acquisition or the maintenance / like preservation of that power and money will bring out both the good and the bad tendencies that someone has. Yeah. So what I wanted to capture here is Allah SWT captures also Fir'aun in Surah Yunus. This is not one of the ayat that focuses on the story of Musa in its totality, but it does get into one thing that's kind of interesting about the mentality of Fir'aun. And that is that when Allah SWT says, وَجَاوَزْنَا بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ الْبَحْرَ فَأَتْبَعَهُمْ فِرْعَوْنُ وَجُنُودُهُ بَغْيًا وَعَدْوًا. And we took the children of the Bani Israel to the sea, and Fir'aun followed them, and his army followed as well in rebellion, baghyan, and enmity. So they came to do what? Kill him. حتى إذا أدركه الغرق, until finally the drowning overtook them, meaning the water overtook them. And as he was غرق is also one of those onomatopoeia words. Like it sounds like someone's drying, like as the water is reaching his throat. قال آمنت أنه لا إله إلا الذي أن آمنت به بنو إسرائيل وأنا من المسلمين. And Pharaoh says in that moment, as he's drowning, I believe in no one except for the Lord, except for the ones that the Banu Israel believed in, and I'm one of the Muslims. Pharaoh apparently said that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues, الآن قد عصيت قبل وكنت من المفسدين. Now, and you had disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so much beforehand, and you were someone who was causing so much fasad. فَالْيَوْمَ نُنَجِّيكَ بِبَدَنِكَ لِتَكُونَ لِمَنْ خَلْفَكَ آيَةً. So today we will save you in body so that you may be a sign for those who succeed you, who come after you. وَإِنْ كَثِيرًا مِنَ النَّاسِ عَنْ آيَاتِنَا لَغَافِلُونَ. And indeed, many from amongst the people of our signs will be heedless when I know what actually happened. Well, someone tell me what actually took place here. What did Allah SWT say about Fir'aun? First and foremost, his submission. What was basically done is Fir'aun followed them in enmity, and his last action was to try to kill the Bani Israel. Once he realizes it is hopeless and he's about to be drowned, he goes, hey, I have a way out, which is what? I can just say in this moment that I believe in the Lord of Moses and the Lord of the Bani Israel. Everything is fine. There's a couple of interesting things here. There are opinions that say Fir'aun died as a believer. Very, very non-orthodox opinions that say that. Generally speaking, what's understood is, no, that's not what's going on. What's happening here is, as Fir'aun is doing that, he can't actually get himself to say it. What does he not say? He doesn't say, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illa alladhina amanat bihi banu Israel. He can't get himself to actually submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because that's not what his life represented in any way, shape, or form. That's not it. So he can't even get himself to say that. It doesn't even say Rabbu Musa wa Harun or anything like that. He has to just keep it as the Banu Israel, or that abstract concept, because submission isn't sincere. There's another narration that says that while this was happening, that Fir'aun was coming to this realization that Jibreel alayhi salam heard Pharaoh gargling, and he quickly came down from the heavens and put mud into the mouth of Pharaoh, because he was afraid. Well, it's kind of a weird tangent, but he thought that Allah's mercy was so vast that Allah could forgive even Fir'aun, so he intervened. Now, I have to put the preface here that angels don't act other than how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills. So it's not like Jibreel alayhi salam was doing something counter to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any way, shape, or form. But I think it's still quite an interesting story in terms of, like, this is a mindset that some people have, which is what? I'll do whatever I want, but at the end of my life, I'll donate all my money to charity. Yes, Ala, this is the part where Pharaoh is dying. Sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit because I wanted to get to this ayah. I didn't know where to fit this ayah in our next session, so I decided to fit it in here. This is when Pharaoh is dying, and he's trying to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right before he's dying, because he's chasing the Egyptians chasing the Bani Israel out of Egypt. And he's drowning, and he thinks, I can just believe. And this is something that some of us might have the mindset of. I can just be religious when I'm old, is a typical way of doing it. I can fix my ways later. This is one of those, the ends and the means are the same thing. Pharaoh's not going to be able to submit at the end. Why? Al-ana, now? When وَقَدْ عَصَيْتَ قَبْلُ, when you were disobeying before, وَكُنْتَ مِنَ الْمُفْسِدِينَ, and you were amongst those who were constantly causing fasad. That's all you're going to be able to do in that moment too. This is not to say that people cannot change, because what's been happening this entire time, Musa has been calling Fir'aun, change your ways, change your ways, change your ways. You can change when it's an authentic change, and you have the ability of changing. When it is by no actual Like you're just doing it as a preservation. This is the same thing as the Egyptians saying beforehand, what? Just let us be comfortable again and we'll do what you want. And then as soon as comfort came, they denied Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala once again, or they continued doing the fasad. Same thing of Fir'aun. You can't, there's no way to do that with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah saw exactly what is happening. And actually, as a result, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the next ayah even said, we're actually going to preserve your body so that everyone will look at you and hopefully there'll be a reminder for those who actually believe. Even though, unfortunately, what now happens? People pay hundreds of dollars to go see the body of Pharaoh and go, how great was the Pharaoh? How great was Egypt? Let's turn the pyramids into a tourist destination. Weird. What was it supposed to be? A huge reminder of like, this is what can happen. If anyone's went and seen the pyramids in person, I'm not telling you did something wrong. My point is, it wasn't supposed to be a reminder of kind of greatness or something like that. It was supposed to be a admission of kind of humility almost, that what people see as great isn't what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees as great. And we care more about what Allah sees as great, not what like others would see it that way. I've seen a couple of the chat things and I have not been looking at them. Let me just check what's going on. The scene from Moana comes up to my head, but this is just worse. I don't know what scene you're talking about, but sure. I don't think it's bad, no. Anyone else? Any reflections or comments for today?
I was just wondering, Assalamu alaikum. I was, in the Quran, the story of Musa, it's found in various parts, but also in like surahs that, that don't have to do with the story of Musa.
Yeah.
So I just thought that was kind of interesting, like how it's like, I think Surah Muzammil, it's found there, like Fir'aun is mentioned, Fir'aun is there. Surah Isra, right? So I just think it's like really interesting how this is supposed to be like this. There's a certain sort of universality when it comes to the surah. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, there is, and I think it's because there's two ways of looking at it. One is that's how important the story of Musa alayhi salam and Fir'aun really is, that it's found everywhere. And the other could be stop moving. Okay. The other could be that the examples that are found within it are, how do I put this? It's almost the extreme forms of the smaller or more subtle lessons found in other stories. If that makes sense. This would be the idea of, what's a good parallel? I don't know. You know how sometimes you use an example and you move to the absurdist form of the example just to hit home a point. I think the Quran oftentimes does that with Pharaoh, meaning that, and I think we do that in our own language, where someone is being a mean manager. Like, what are you, a Pharaoh? Like, what are you, a tyrant? It's the idea that you go to the furthest extreme because that's possible for it to go there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that's absolutely right. Surah Nadiyat had the story of Fir'aun in there. Well, Surah Al-Qasas actually has quite a bit of it, but like there'll be times in which Pharaoh is just mentioned. Of like any example of someone who's done a huge harm. Surah Muzammil, yeah, you already used that. Surah Al-Fajr, Pharaoh's added in there. Fir'auna wa Thamud. Like it's constant because it's supposed to be something you keep in your mind. Like even the smallest actions that I do that have fasad or fisq in them or disobedience in them have the possibility of inventing an entire system of corruption like Pharaoh did. But it did start off with a smaller action. Ala asked, you missed the point about the pyramids. Oh, we'll focus on this a little bit more in a few weeks when the Bani Israel will complain to Musa alayhi salam and the archetype of the pyramids comes in. But there's this idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserved the pharaoh in terms of body. And a lot of people looked at this and like, this means King Ramses. The second, when they've done the archaeological records, it said that, oh, what's actually going on here is that pharaoh had probably drowned when they did like the anthropology. I don't know which field of science is it, but they looked at what the cause of death probably was, and it probably was drowning. Like this is what it's talking about, and it could be. I personally think it's talking a little bit more than that. I think it's talking about like we preserved you in body, like your empire in body. What other empire has as significant of a structure that was built that we still can't to this day fully explain how they made it, other than the Egyptians? Allah preserved their legacy, but it was supposed to be a sign. But most people don't understand the actual sign. Yeah. And in another place, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Qasas, so similarly, this is where I wasn't able to cover all of the times that this is mentioned because there's slightly more details every single time, but it's very similar. وَاسْتَكْبَرَ هُوَ وَجُنُودُهُ. He was arrogant and his army was completely arrogant fil ard without haqq. وَظَنُّوا أَنَّهُمْ إِلَيْنَا لَا يُرْجَعُونَ. And without right, and they thought that they would not be returned to us. So we took him and his soldiers and threw them into the sea. So see, that was the end of the wrongdoers. The other element that this was is Egypt was the first naval power in the world that we know of. Kind of ironic that their superpower died via just in the water. Just very, very kind of interesting how that happened. And that'll be the argument. Why did Egypt become so significant? It was because they were masters of the sea. Well, their strength was their downfall, it seems like. In this case, they didn't prepare for it. And there's a degree of kind of imagery there as well, that the thing that they prided themselves on is the thing that actually ended up destroying them too. It's a sad point to leave on, but I want you to think about the other side of this, which is Musa alayhi salam was completely accurate when he was talking to the Bani Israel, and he was saying, you die the way you live. Yeah, that's definitely an Islamic concept. But Musa alayhi salam was completely accurate when he talked to the Bani Israel, and he said, Pharaoh is going through a trial, and you guys are going through a trial too. Let's see who does better, and how you would have done with the power of the trial of power. They failed it, but alhamdulillah, the Bani Israel passed for the most part the trial of patience. That they went through a trial, Pharaoh went through a trial. This was the end result of Pharaoh's trial. What's going to be the end result of our trial? Was found within it. That's something for all of us to reflect on. Is in moments of comfort, in moments of happiness, in moments of power, and these type of things. What are we going to do with it? Versus on the other side, if we're in moments of oppression, moments of being a victim, moments of powerlessness, are we going to respond appropriately? And what's going to be really interesting is the script is going to be switched now. Starting next week, we're going to wrap up a few more ayat about the Bani Israel leaving Egypt, about kind of the preparations that were made, and then them establishing themselves as a nation. And when they establish themselves as a nation, they find themselves on the opposite end, where they do have power. They do now have to organize a whole society just based on themselves and organize rules of justice. And they're going to go through their growing pains as well. And they're going to have to learn how to not become pharaohs. Yes, Vishan, we can make the argument that they're Medina. And they're going to have to realize how to not be pharaohs. And that'll take place as well. Yes, next week will be our last one before break. We'll wrap up the story of Musa alayhi salam we could call it his hijrah of leaving Egypt, and then we'll continue next semester with the story of Bani Israel as is found within the Quran. not just of Musa alayhi salam anymore, because the story of Musa alayhi salam and Bani Israel is a part of it, but the Bani Israel story continues well after Musa alayhi salam passes away. So we'll focus on that inshallah next time we're together. Sound good? Why didn't they stay in Egypt if Pharaoh's rule ended? Very, very good question. Lots of ways of answering that. One is they saw that this was supposed to be, their homeland was actually this place of Yusuf alayhi salam, which was Palestine to begin with. Remember, in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, the Bani Israel left Palestine to go to Egypt. Now they leave Egypt to go back to Palestine. That's going to be one. They want to go back to their ancestral home, is one component of it. Another will be, why would you want to be in the place that you were oppressed for hundreds of years? I doubt there's probably going to be trauma, and sometimes a change of scenery is absolutely necessary in order to establish a change in kind of like character and a change in power and like a sense of home and belonging. That the place that you had suffered for so long actually has too many scars for you, so it actually is a good idea to move. But that's more of a psychological answer. And the main reason I can say is because Allah told Musa alayhi salam to leave, so that's probably the biggest answer there. Yeah, so,
Oh, and I was gonna say, and I guess like, you know, you don't know what regime will take over after Pharaoh leaves.
that's a very good point, because we know that Pharaoh and his army went, but yeah, there's probably a power vacuum that was left. There's probably still way more things going on in Egypt. So yeah, makes lots of practical sense as well. So with that, we'll conclude for today. May Allah SWT allow us to be amongst those that recognize the trial of power and the trial of powerlessness. And that when we are moments in powerlessness, that we respond with optimism and patience. And that when we are in the trial of power, that we respond with humility and gratitude. And that Allah SWT allow us to be amongst those that are not on the side of jurm or fasad, of harm or corruption, regardless of which type of trial that we are given. And that we're people that when Allah gives us a trial, we actually hold on more fastly to the things that Allah wants us to preserve, which is guidance, family, and justice. And that when moments of trial come in, which are of power and luxury, that we hold on to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to hold on to in those moments, which is gratitude, the ability of showing that we attribute these things to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and don't get drunk on our own abilities of acquiring wealth or fame or authority. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum assalam.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.